Dawn had not yet fully broken over the Pelennor fields. A faint light filtered through the gray clouds, shining down on a battlefield that had almost been swallowed by darkness. Before the gates of Minas Tirith, the army of Mordor stretched out like a black ocean, endless and cold. The siege engines roared. Giant creatures walked, each footstep seemingly crushing all hope. And then, a sound rang out. A horn blast. Not loud, not overwhelming, but enough to make the entire battlefield pause for a moment. On top of the hill, Théoden stood there, sword raised high, his eyes looking not toward victory, but toward something further, a memory, a promise, an unbreakable thing. Behind him were thousands of cavalry, farmers, warriors, people who had grown up on the plains, now facing an enemy they knew they could not defeat with sheer strength alone. But they came anyway. The horses began to move, slowly, then faster. The sound of hooves blended with heartbeats. The wind howled through the green banners bearing the symbol of the white horse. And then they charged down. A wave, a storm, a decision with no turning back. No one ordered a halt. No one asked if they would survive. Because that moment was no longer about life or death, but about keeping an oath. What made them do it? What made a kingdom that was not the largest, not the strongest, become the spearhead that changed the fate of the entire world? The answer does not lie in Pelennor, but in the past. The wind blew across the endless plains of the north. There, before Rohan existed, there were only horse-reliant tribes, wandering between sky and earth. They had no sturdy fortresses, no stone walls, no thrones cast in gold. But they had something else. They had speed, they had freedom, and they had promises carved deeper than any wall. Among them was a man whose name would never be forgotten, Eorl the Young. He was not born to be a king. He was not chosen by fate. He became a symbol by a decision. When Gondor, the southern kingdom, was attacked and stood on the brink of collapse, their cry for help was not directed at Eorl, but he heard it anyway, not with his ears, but with something deeper, a feeling that if he did not act, the world would change in an unsalvageable way. And he rode out. No waiting, no calculating, no negotiating. Simply going. With him were riders, those who believed in him, or perhaps believed in what he represented. They crossed plains, rivers, lands that no one thought could be traversed in time. And when they arrived, the battle was almost lost. But that was exactly when everything changed. In the Battle of the Field of Celebrant, they did not fight like a conventional army. They did not hold positions. They did not defend. They charged in like an uncontrollable wind, flanking, breaking formations, sowing chaos, not with numbers, but with the moment. And in that moment, they turned the tide of an entire war. Gondor was saved, but more importantly, a bond was born. Not by a contract, not by power, but by an oath. Eorl was granted the land of Calenardon, the place that would later be called Rohan, but he did not accept it as a reward. He accepted it as a responsibility, a promise spoken, not for the present, but for all generations to come, that when Gondor calls, Rohan will come. Many years passed. The plains still stretched out as before, The horses still ran under the vast sky, but Rohan was no longer a tribe. It became a kingdom, not because they built higher walls, but because they kept their promise longer. Children grew up hearing the stories of Eorl, not as a distant legend, but as a standard. Warriors learned to fight, not just to survive, but to be ready to answer when called. And every succeeding king inherited not just the throne, but inherited an oath. But oaths always come with a price, because one day, a time would come when Rohan had to choose between protecting themselves and keeping their promise to others. Returning to Pelennor, the sound of hooves still rang out. The distance between life and death narrowed increasingly. But for those charging down that field, this was not the first time they faced such a choice, and it would not be the last, because the story of Rohan was never just about war, but about the moments when a person or a kingdom decides who they are. The wind never stands still on the plains of Rohan. It is always moving, carrying the scent of grass, the sound of hooves, and stories never written into books. In that place, a child does not learn how to become a warrior. They learn how to listen, listening to the horses breathing, listening to the shift of the wind, listening for when to advance and when to charge in without hesitation. For Rohan, strength never came from city walls or numbers. It comes from the unity of human emotion. A Rohirrim rider does not just ride a horse. He becomes a part of it. Every lean of the body, every tightening of the reins, every spur of the heel all require no thought. They happen as instinct. And that is exactly what creates the thing their enemies fear most. Not that they are stronger, but that they are faster than their opponents' decisions. In the peaceful years, when war was only a distant memory, Rohan never ceased preparing, not by hoarding weapons, but by maintaining a way of life. The fields are not just for farming, they are training grounds. The horses are not just property, they are comrades. And every generation that grows up carries within them an unspoken question. When the time comes, will I dare to ride out? But that time finally came, not from the outside, but from the inside. In the west, Saruman began to change. Once one of the greatest minds, he now no longer sought balance. He sought power, and unlike other enemies, Saruman did not attack immediately. He waited, he observed, and, most importantly, he understood Rohan. He knew their strength did not lie in weapons, but in spirit. So, he did not destroy them with war right from the start. He did something more dangerous. He made them doubt themselves. In the great hall of Meduseld, where songs and oaths once echoed, silence began to creep in. Théoden, the once strong king, gradually became distant. Not because he was weak, but because he was isolated. Advices were twisted, decisions were delayed, warnings were ignored, and meanwhile, Rohan slowed down. A kingdom born of speed was now trapped in hesitation. On the outside, villages began to be attacked, not by large armies, but by small, precise, continuous raids. They were not aimed at immediate annihilation. They aimed to weaken, making the people lose faith, making the warriors exhausted, making Rohan no longer itself. But then, like all storms, the silence could not last forever. One day, the truth could no longer be hidden. Rohan had no more time to hesitate. They had to choose: stay and be crushed piece by piece, or retreat, regroup, and face the enemy in a decisive battle. They chose Helm's Deep. Helm's Deep was not a symbol of strength. It was the symbol of the final defense. High stone walls, a fortress hidden among the mountains, enough to hold out, but not enough to win, and everyone knew that. As night fell, the rain began to fall. Not a light rain, but a heavy rain, as if the sky too was bearing the weight of the coming battle. In the distance, torchlight appeared. Thousands, then tens of thousands. Saruman's army approached not like a chaotic mob, but like a machine, precise, cold, without hesitation. Inside the fortress, the civilians huddled together. The warriors stood on the walls, looking down. No one said much. It was unnecessary, because everyone understood. This was not a battle they could win with strength. This was a battle they had to endure. The first wave of attack came fast. Arrows rained down. Ladders were raised. The sound of clashing metal rang out in the night. And then, an explosion. The wall was breached. That moment was the moment everything could collapse. But Rohan did not shatter. They fell back. They held their formation. They continued to fight, not because they believed they would win, but because they were not ready to lose everything. Time dragged on. The night seemed to have no end. Every passing minute was a trial. Every step back was a difficult decision. And in that darkness, a question began to form. Would Rohan still be Rohan if they only knew how to defend? The answer came when the first light appeared, not from the sun, but from a decision. The fortress gates opened. The cavalry assembled. No more walls ahead. Nowhere left to retreat. Only one way, forward. They charged out of Helm's Deep, not like people fleeing, but like those who had decided that if it must end, it would end their way. And in that moment, Rohan returned. Dawn came slowly to Helm's Deep. Light filtered through the thinning rain, shining on the chipped walls, the swords stained with mud and blood, and the people who were still standing. They had not fallen, not because they were stronger, but because they did not stop. When the gates opened and the cavalry charged down from the fortress, it was not a perfectly calculated counterattack. It was a decision born from the absolute limit. Nowhere left to retreat, no more time to wait. Only one choice remained: forward. In that moment, Rohan was no longer a kingdom backed into a corner. They returned to being themselves, a force defined by motion, by speed, by the ability to turn a seemingly desperate situation into a moment that could change everything. The victory at Helm's Deep was not the end. It was an awakening, a reminder that Rohan's strength did not lie in how long they could withstand, but in when they chose to stand up. But even before the smoke and dust of the battle had time to settle, another piece of news arrived, not bringing hope, but bringing a choice harder than anything they had just endured. Gondor was falling. In the south, Denethor III was in despair within his own citadel. The beacons had been lit peak by peak, tower by tower, transmitting an unmistakable message. A cry for help that Rohan had sworn to answer. But this time, things were not simple. Rohan had just been through a war. Their forces were depleted. Their lands had not yet recovered. And most importantly, they knew that if they left, if they committed all their strength to save Gondor, then Rohan would have nothing left to protect itself. In the great hall of Meduseld, silence appeared once again. Not the silence of doubt, but the silence of choice. Théoden stood there, no longer the isolated king, no longer the hesitant man, but the man who had to decide what defined his kingdom. He could stay, protect what was left, ensure that Rohan survived, regardless of what happened to Gondor. That would be a rational decision, a decision that many could understand. Or he could ride out, lead the remaining warriors, answer the call, and bet everything on a battle they were not sure they could win. This was not a choice between right and wrong. This was a choice between safety and identity. And finally, he chose. Rohan would ride. Not because they were forced to do so, but because if they did not, they would no longer be Rohan. The journey began in silence. There were no cheers. There were no songs of victory. Only the sound of hooves, steady, ringing on the ground. They were not in a hurry, not because they did not need to be, but because they understood that the moment they arrived was what mattered. Along the way, the fields gradually changed. The green of Rohan gave way to more arid lands. The air grew heavier, and in the distance, a giant pillar of black smoke rose, Minas Tirith. As they drew closer, the sound of war began to grow clearer. The clash of metal, the screaming, the sound of a city being pushed to its absolute limit. But they did not stop. They continued forward until they stood atop a hill, looking down at the entire Pelennor fields. And what they saw was not a battle, but a nightmare. The army of Mordor stretched to the horizon. Giant creatures moved among the formations, dense ranks of troops with no gaps, no obvious weaknesses, no easy chances. And in the distance, Minas Tirith was burning. That moment, everything became clear. They did not come to win a battle. They came to change the unchangeable. No one spoke it aloud. It was unnecessary, because they all understood. What was about to happen would define them forever. Théoden rode forward. He looked down at his army, the people who had followed him here, the people who knew exactly what they were facing. He did not speak of victory. He did not promise a future. He only reminded them who they were. And then he raised his sword. The moment Théoden raised his sword, the time seemed to slow down. Not because the battlefield stopped moving, but because everything important had converged on a single point. The wind stopped blowing. The banners stopped flying. Even the horses seemed to hold their breath. Below them, the Pelennor fields were still a dense black sea of troops. The clash of metal still echoed from the foot of Minas Tirith. The siege engines continued to move forward. Nothing had changed. Except for one thing, Rohan had arrived. But presence was never enough. They could not stand there. They could not wait. Because, with every passing second, Gondor crept closer to collapse. And then, the horn sounded. This time, not just one, but hundreds. The sound spread across the hill, echoing down to the plain, piercing even through the noise of war. An unmistakable sound, a declaration. Théoden did not look toward the enemy. He looked toward the men behind him, the riders who had traveled with him the entire journey, the people who were waiting, not for an order, but for a reason. And he gave them that reason, not with a long speech, but with a moment, a look, a gesture, a certainty that needed no explanation. The sword was lowered. The horses began to move, slowly, orderly, unhurried. This was not impulsiveness. This was consensus. Thousands of people making a decision together. The speed gradually increased. The sound of hooves became clearer. The ground shook, not because of the strength of each individual, but because of synchronization. The wind returned. The green banner with the white horse symbol flew. Sunlight caught the blades, reflecting into blinding flashes of light. And then they charged down, not like an army, but like a storm. The distance between them and the enemy narrowed rapidly. Below, the army of Mordor began to realize what was happening. Ranks shifted. Spears pointed upward. Shouts rang out. But it was too late. The clash happened. Not a sudden halt, but a piercing through. Mordor's formation was torn apart. Not because it was weak, but because it was not made to deal with this. The Rohan cavalry did not stop after the initial clash. They continued moving, changing directions, encircling, striking into the gaps that had just been created. This was not a chaotic battle. This was a series of perfectly utilized moments. Elsewhere on the battlefield, Éomer led another spearhead. No need for orders. No need to wait. Just seeing the opportunity and acting. But the battlefield never has only one side. From deep within Mordor's formation, a dark shadow stepped forth. The Witch King of Angmar. His presence was unlike any other warrior. Not because of his size, but because of the feeling he brought. A coldness, a formless fear, even as Rohan's cavalry pushed back the enemy formation. The moment he appeared, the tide began to turn. Théoden moved forward. No hesitation, no backing down. The confrontation did not last long, but it was enough to leave an indelible mark. When it ended, one thing became clear. Victory would not come without a price. In the middle of the battlefield, Éowyn stood there, no longer hiding, no longer constrained by the role society had set. She did not fight to prove anything. She fought because this was the moment she chose. And in that very moment, one of the most terrifying forces of darkness was defeated. But the battle continued. Rohan did not stop, could not stop, because they understood that what they were doing was not just fighting for the present, but keeping the future in existence. Gradually, the tide began to turn, not because Rohan completely defeated the enemy, but because they created a space for hope. And sometimes, just a small space is enough to change everything. As the sun rose higher, light shone down on the plain. What remained was not a perfect victory, but a battlefield full of the marks of choices. Rohan did not leave Pelennor as conquerors. They left as those who had accomplished something greater than themselves. Because in the end, the story of Rohan was never about how strong they were, but about whether, when the time comes, they ride or not. And they rode, from Eorl to Théoden, to all those who had stood on that field. The oath remained, not as a spoken phrase, but as an action, repeated, proven, remembered. Rohan was not the largest kingdom, not the richest kingdom, nor the invincible kingdom. But when the world needed them, they were always the ones who rode forth. And sometimes, that is enough to change history.